The road was quiet, too quiet for war. It was the winter of 1944, somewhere along the frozen roads of Western Europe, and a small group of German soldiers crouched behind a line of bare trees, watching the distance. They had been waiting for hours. Their boots were cracked, their coats were thin. Supply lines had been stretched so far they had nearly snapped. These men hadn't seen fresh ammunition in 3 days. They had almost forgotten what a full meal tasted like. Then they heard it. That familiar growl, that low, rattling engine sound that had become the sound of American momentum. A jeep came bouncing down the road, kicking up frozen mud, its canvas top down despite the bitter cold. 2 Americans inside. No armor, no escort, just 2 soldiers moving fast through open country like they owned it, because for most of 1944, they did. The ambush was over in seconds. The Americans were captured, the jeep was taken, and as the German soldiers crowded around the vehicle, running their hands over the steering wheel, the canvas seats, the tools mounted along the side, something quietly shifted inside them. Not celebration, not triumph, something harder to name, something that sat in the stomach like a stone. This was not the first American jeep the Germans had captured. It would not be the last. But over the course of the war, each one told the same story, a story the German high command didn't want to hear, a story that generals on both sides of the front understood long before their soldiers did. The jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was a message, and the message said, "We are losing." To understand what that little vehicle meant, you have to go back to before the war. Before the bombs, before the invasions, before the uniforms. You have to go back to a question that military planners in America were quietly asking themselves in the late 1930s. The question was simple. How do you move an army? Not tanks. Tanks were understood. Not ships or planes or artillery. Those had their place. The question was about the infantry soldier, the man on the ground, the man who had to move from point A to point B, cross rivers and mountains and bombed-out roads, carry equipment, deliver orders, scout positions, evacuate wounded, haul ammunition, and do all of it fast enough to actually win a modern war. The American answer was the jeep. In 1940, the U.S. Army sent out a request to American manufacturers. They needed a lightweight, general-purpose vehicle. It had to weigh under 1,300 pounds, it had to carry a payload of 600 pounds, it had to have 4-wheel drive, it had to be simple enough for any soldier to maintain in the field, and it had to be built, thousands of them, almost immediately. Bantam Car Company submitted the first design, Willys Overland improved it, Ford mass-produced it, and within months the American industrial machine began pumping out jeeps at a rate no one in Europe thought possible. By the end of the war, over 640,000 jeeps had been manufactured. 640,000. The Germans, by contrast, rely heavily on horses. Even deep into the Second World War, the Wehrmacht depended on horse-drawn supply carts for a significant portion of its logistics. It was not incompetence. Germany simply did not have the industrial capacity, the rubber supplies, or the fuel infrastructure to motorize its entire army. The horses served a purpose, but they could not match what the Americans were building. When a German soldier looked at an American jeep, he was not just looking at a vehicle, he was looking at the gap between what his country could manufacture and what America could produce without seeming to even try. The jeep could go almost anywhere. Its 4-wheel drive system, revolutionary for a light vehicle at that time, allowed it to cross fields that would swallow ordinary cars, climb slopes that turned back heavier trucks, ford streams that stopped horse-drawn carts. It was compact enough to fit inside a cargo plane, light enough to be airlifted by a few early military helicopters. It could serve as an ambulance, a command car, a scout vehicle, or a supply runner. And it was everywhere.
By the time American forces were pushing through France in the summer of 1944, the Jeep had become the connective tissue of the entire Allied war machine. Generals rode in them, sergeants used them to push forward reconnaissance, supply chains depended on them, wounded men were carried into field hospitals in them. They moved through the night with headlights blacked out, navigating by moonlight and instinct and the knowledge that somewhere up ahead the mission was waiting. The German soldiers began capturing them early. It was inevitable. In the chaos of mobile warfare, vehicles were lost, abandoned, taken. A broken-down Jeep in a ditch, a crew cut off from their unit, a wrong turn on an unmarked road. The Germans collected them, studied them, sometimes used them. And every time they did, the same quiet reckoning took place. German mechanics were trained, disciplined, thorough. When they stripped down a captured Jeep, they were not careless. They went through it systematically. The engine, the drivetrain, the electrical system, the chassis welds, the tooling marks on the individual parts. What they found told a story in metal. American manufacturing was not perfect. Some of the tolerances were loose by German engineering standards. Some of the fittings were rougher than what a German craftsman would have produced. But none of that mattered, because what the Americans had done wasn't about perfection, it was about scale. Every part in that Jeep was standardized. A bolt from one Jeep fit another Jeep. A carburetor pulled from a wreck in Italy could be fitted into a vehicle in France. The interchangeability was the point. It meant that an army spread across an entire continent could maintain its vehicles in the field, with minimal tools, with minimal expertise, with soldiers who had been mechanics for only a few months. The German vehicles, magnificent as many of them were, did not always share this simplicity. The Wehrmacht operated hundreds of different vehicle types by the middle of the war. Parts were difficult to source. Repairs required skilled labor. When a German vehicle broke down far from a depot, it often stayed broken. When an American Jeep broke down, a soldier with a wrench and a manual could usually fix it by morning. The Germans understood this. The mechanics understood it. The intelligence officers who reviewed the reports understood it. And slowly, painfully, the truth worked its way up the chain of command. America was not just producing weapons, it was producing a system, a self-replicating, self-repairing, continent-spanning machine for making war, and the Jeep was its smallest, most visible symbol. There was a moment in late 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, that captures this truth more clearly than anything else. The Germans launched their last great offensive in the West in December of that year. It was bold, it was desperate, it was designed to split the Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before Soviet forces closed in from the east. For a brief and terrifying window, it looked like it might work. German panzers pushed through the Ardennes in fog and snow. American lines buckled. Units were surrounded. Communications broke down. In the confusion of those first days, some German special operations teams, led by Otto Skorzeny, disguised themselves in American uniforms and drove American Jeeps behind Allied lines. Operation Greif, it was called. The plan was to cause chaos, to misdirect traffic, to spread confusion at key crossroads, to cut communication lines. Small teams of German soldiers, fluent in English, dressed in American gear, riding in American Jeeps, slipping through the rear areas of the Allied front. It worked, partially. It spread panic. Rumors flew through American rear echelons that thousands of German saboteurs were loose, that road signs had been changed, that assassins were targeting Eisenhower himself. Checkpoints went up across France and Belgium. Soldiers were questioned on baseball scores and American slang. The entire rear area of the Allied operation tightened in fear.
But here is what the Germans could not have anticipated. The panic they created was manageable, because the American system, the same system that produced Jeeps by the 100,000, could absorb it. Replacement units arrived. Supply lines were rerouted. New communication protocols were issued within hours.
The American army was not just large, it was resilient in the way that only an industrialized, standardized force can be resilient. And, crucially, the Germans could only field a small number of disguised teams because they only had a small number of captured American jeeps that were functional, fueled, and equipped well enough to pass close inspection. Skorzeny had requested 150 vehicles for the operation. He received a handful. The Americans had hundreds of thousands. That asymmetry, that vast, almost incomprehensible asymmetry in supply, was what ultimately made Operation Greif a footnote instead of a turning point. The Germans had seized a tool, but they could not seize the factory. They could not seize the trained workforce, the supply chain, the rubber from South America, the steel from Pittsburgh, the engineers in Detroit who had designed the whole system. They could take the Jeep. They could not take what produced it. There was something else the Germans encountered when they studied captured American equipment, something harder to quantify than engine tolerances or supply numbers. It was the quality of the ordinary. A standard-issue American soldier in 1944 was not necessarily better trained than his German counterpart. The Wehrmacht had been at war since 1939. Many German soldiers had 5 years of combat experience, years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, a depth of tactical knowledge that American draftees simply could not match in the early years. German unit cohesion was, in many cases, extraordinary. They fought hard and they fought smart. But the American soldier carried something his German opponent often did not. He carried enough. Enough food, enough ammunition, enough medical supplies, enough replacement parts, enough fuel. The logistics chains that fed the American frontline soldier were not glamorous. They were not the stuff of legend, but they were consistent in a way that the German supply system, stretched across 2 fronts and hammered by Allied air power, could no longer match by 1944. The Jeep was part of that consistency. It meant that a company commander in the field had a vehicle fast enough to visit 2 forward positions in an afternoon, return for a briefing, and still have time to coordinate artillery support for the next morning. It meant that a medical unit could respond to a casualty call 3 miles away without waiting for horses or foot messengers. It meant that the rhythm of the American war machine stayed steady even under pressure. When German officers watched American operations through binoculars, as they often did during periods of relative quiet, they noted this. The constant movement behind American lines, the jeeps appearing and disappearing on distant roads, the impression of an army that never stopped working, never stopped moving, never seemed to run short of the small things that kept a fighting force alive. One German officer captured in France in the late summer of 1944 was asked by his American interrogators what had surprised him most about fighting the U.S. Army. He thought for a moment. He mentioned the air power, yes, the artillery, yes, but then he said something that stayed with the officer conducting the interrogation for the rest of his life. He said the jeeps surprised him. Not one jeep, not a specific action, just the jeeps. The sheer number of them, the way they were everywhere, the way American soldiers seemed to treat a military vehicle as casually as a farmer treats a tractor, the way there were always more coming. In Germany, that captured officer explained, a vehicle was a resource to be conserved. In America, it seemed to be a resource to be used, fully, constantly, without hesitation. That difference in philosophy, that difference in what an industrial nation could afford to assume, was one of the deepest truths of the Second World War. And you could read it in that little 4-wheel drive vehicle that American factories produced by the hundreds of thousands, that American soldiers drove across every theater of the war, that German soldiers studied in captured workshops on cold winter nights, trying to understand how their enemy could fight this way. They could read the Jeep. What they could not read was America. They could not read a country that had converted its entire civilian automobile industry to war production in months.
A country that built Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. A country that trained pilots, soldiers, mechanics, and nurses at a pace that seemed, to the exhausted armies of Europe, almost supernatural. They could not understand a nation where a factory worker in Michigan felt personally connected to the soldier in France, where bond drives and scrap metal collections and victory gardens created a shared sense of investment in the outcome, an entire civilian population that had decided, not just been ordered, to win. The Jeep was made from that country. And when German soldiers put their hands on it, captured in a forward depot somewhere in the winter of 1944, they were touching something they could break but not replicate, something they could take but not understand, something pointing, quietly, mechanically, inevitably, toward the outcome of the war. After the war, Eisenhower was asked about the weapons and tools that had contributed most to the Allied victory. He mentioned several, but among them, consistently, he named the Jeep. Not the Sherman tank, though it fought on every front. Not the B-17 bomber, though it shook the foundations of the Reich. The Jeep, that small, unglamorous four-wheel drive workhorse that carried his army across North Africa, up through Italy, across France, through the Ardennes, and finally to the banks of the Rhine. It carried generals and privates. It pulled artillery and evacuated the wounded. It crossed rivers and climbed mountains and ran through the night with its lights off and its engine humming. It had been ambushed and captured and shot at and driven into ditches and driven back out again. It had been taken apart by German mechanics who understood exactly what it represented and put back together by American soldiers who simply needed to keep moving. The Jeep never stopped moving. Neither did the country that built it. There is a version of military history that focuses entirely on the dramatic moments, the great battles, the famous generals, the turning points where history seemed to hinge on a single decision. And those moments matter. They are real. They are worth remembering. But there is another kind of history, the history of the ordinary. The history of the standard-issue bolt that fits every vehicle in an army. The history of the factory worker who showed up for the night shift and did it again the next night and the night after that. The history of the supply sergeant who made sure the fuel was there when the column needed to move. The history of the small things that had to work every day across an entire continent for 4 years without stopping. That history is the Jeep. And somewhere on a frozen road in Western Europe in the winter of 1944, a German soldier sitting in a captured American vehicle, hands on the wheel, engine quiet, staring at the standardized dashboard, the interchangeable parts, the engineering of a country that had decided to bury the Third Reich under an avalanche of production, understood something that no amount of tactical brilliance could answer. You can win battles against an army. You cannot win a war against a factory. The question that lingers decades later is not whether American industrial power was decisive. It clearly was. The question is what it felt like to be on the other side of it, to be the soldier examining the Jeep, to be the officer reading the production reports, to know with the cold certainty of a trained military mind that the gap between what your country could produce and what your enemy was producing was a gap you could not close, not in a month, not in a year, not ever. What does a soldier do with that knowledge? What does a commander do? What does a nation do? If you were there, in that frozen depot, in that winter, with your hands on that steering wheel, what would you have thought? Leave your answer below. The history deserves that conversation.